The Indianapolis 500, one of the most famous races in the world and a race where legends are made. Feel like I've done a similar intro like this before. The race has offered a lot of great moments and storylines over the years, from San Hornish Jr.'s win in 2006 where he got Marco Andretti right on the line, to the 6-lap showdown in 2014 between Helio Castroneves and Ryan Hunter-Reay, in which the latter would come out on top. The circuit has also provided some underdog moments as well, such as during Bump Day in 2019 when young cars who were going through some financial difficulties would manage to qualify for the race in the hands of Kyle Kaiser, knocking out two-time Formula 1 world champion Fernando Alonso in the process, proving that being in Formula 1 doesn't mean that you are able to come over to another series and run circles on everyone. Hello to those who think that IndyCar drivers are crap. But the story we are talking about today didn't just involve one underdog, but two underdogs instead, and come the end of the race, both of them would walk away with different emotions. This is the story of the 2011 Indianapolis 500. The 2011 IndyCar season would mark the 4th season since the merge with Champ Car, and also the final season that the series would use the Dallara IR05 before switching to the IR12 for the start of 2012. Obviously. Heading into the year, Dario Franchitti went in as the reigning 3-time champion, looking to make it 4 by the end of the season, and after the first race at St. Petersburg, in which he would end up taking the win, it looked like it would indeed head in that direction. But in the races that followed, Dario would have stiff competition in the form of Will Power, who was entering his second full-time season with rival team Penske, with him taking victory in 2 of the next 3 races, specifically at Barber and the Sao Paulo street circuit. Power was Franchitti's rival throughout the previous year, with him only just missing out on the title by 6 points, and was determined to flip the script and take home the glory this time around. But outside the title protagonist, there was a notable absence from the IndyCar grid, in the form of Dan Weldon, who after spending 2 years reuniting with Panther Racing, the team he made his debut with back in 2002, following a tumultuous last couple of years with Chip Ganassi Racing, would end up out of a drive at the end of 2010, following a lack of sponsorship which prevented Dan from keeping the seat, which in turn led to him filing a lawsuit against the team, which will eventually get settled later on. His place at Panther would end up being taken by the debuting JR Hildebrand, who finally managed to secure a full-time seat after only doing 2 races with Driver and Reinbold Racing the previous year, following a successful Indy Lights campaign in 2009 in which he would win the title. His first 4 races would end up being decent, with his highest place in those races being an impressive 10th at the Sao Paulo street circuit, and heading into the Indy 500, there was a sense of confidence in the team given what Dan was able to do with them the previous 2 years, with him finishing second in both. On the topic of Dan, with him not having a full-time ride, he would do everything in his power to try and find a ride for the Indy 500, looking at the race as possibly the only chance he had on trying to get back on the grid for 2012, alongside his commitments in testing and developing the new IR12 chassis. After failed negotiations with Driver and Reinbold Racing, the team that Hildebrand did 2 races with in 2010, Weldon would eventually secure a ride for the famous race with Brian Herter Autosport, a team that only formed 2 years prior and had mainly been competing in the Indy Lights Championship. The team made its debut at the Indy 500 the year before, where it would perform a bump day miracle, as they were somehow able to qualify for the 94th edition of the race, despite their driver that year, Sebastian Saavedra, crashing out of the session with just over an hour to go. Saavedra in the race, despite being 2 laps down, was able to complete 159 laps before crashing out at turn 1 thanks to losing the back end. With Dan competing with the team this time around, the hope was that the team would make progress compared to the previous year, with the team intending to run a full-time campaign from 2012 in time for when the IR12 chassis made its debut. But immediately heading into the build-up towards the race, the team would be on the back foot, as the Dallara chassis that they were using, which had been leased by their technical partner Sam Schmidt Motorsports along with Curb Agajanian Motorsports, was first used in 2003, meaning it was 8 years old when BHR took delivery of it. Nevertheless, Dan didn't let the small asterisks get to him, and throughout the build-up towards the Indy 500, he would use his experience of the famous race, which he had won during his championship winning year in 2005, to work closely with the team to try and steer them in the right direction, to try and give them the best chance of being competitive during the race. And whilst it would get off to a slow start, as the practice sessions came and went, Dan would keep climbing his way up the leaderboard, and by the time qualifying came around, Dan would manage to get the car into the Fast 9, with him in the end qualifying an impressive 6th place, putting him on the second row, thanks in large to Dario Franchitti running out of fuel on his 4-lap run. JR Hildebrand, meanwhile, would just miss out on the Fast 9 and would qualify on the 4th row, specifically in 12th place, behind the AJ Foyt of Vitor Meira and the KV racing car of Takuma Sato. Nevertheless, it was still a decent qualifying, but for Wilden and Hildebrand, both knew that it wasn't going to be easy to stay in those positions, especially with a lot of the fast guys being around them. But little did we know that the race would end up being dramatic for both of them for 2 separate reasons. The race itself would celebrate 100 years of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and the anniversary itself would end up witnessing history, as Alex Tagliani in the Sam Schmidt Motorsports car would become the first Canadian to grab pole at the greatest spectacle in racing, with Scott Dixon, who was considered the favourite for the race, starting alongside him in P2, with Oriol Servia in the Newman Haas car completing the front row alongside the pair. Dixon would live up to the idea that he was the favourite by getting the jump on Tagliani at the start to grab the early lead of the race, whilst Wilden on the row behind him would also get a good start by moving up to 4th. Dixon would start to create a bit of a gap up front, whilst Tagliani at the start of lap 3 would gain a position back by moving up to 2nd, having also been jumped by Oriol Servia on the first lap. Weldon would also fancy his chances on Servia, but in doing so would invite Santino Ferrucci's biggest fan, Townsend Bell, to get by on the Brit down the pit straight, with Dario Franchitti, who had also had a good start, also nearly getting by on Dan. Skipping ahead to lap 8, and after leaving Oriol Servia behind to fend off from Townsend Bell, which he would fail to keep behind, Tagliani would catch back up to the Iceman Dixon and would get by on the Kiwi into turn 1 to move back up into the lead. 2 laps later, and Weldon, after managing to fend off from good friend Franchitti, would become the next person to overtake Servia to move back up into 4th, whilst the leaders meanwhile would come up to traffic, in the form of Simona Di Silvestro, who was forced to make an impromptu stop following slight contact with the wall early on as a byproduct of her hands being burnt in an horrific crash during testing ahead of the 500. Simona would end up coming back to the pits the same lap the leaders caught up to her, whilst Dario Franchitti would follow what Dan Weldon did and pass Oriol Servia on the pit straight to move up to 5th. Skipping ahead to lap 20, and trouble would hit the polarising Paul Tracy, who was forced to make an impromptu stop following a tap with the wall at turn 4 as a result of getting up on the dirty side of the track. But his collision with the wall wouldn't cause the first caution, as that would come courtesy of Takuma Sato, who a lap later would make the same error as Tracy at turn 1, but would end up bringing his race to a close due to severe damage to his suspension. Naturally, with a caution, drivers would often take advantage of this by diving into the pits for fresh rubble and fuel. And that's exactly what would happen here, with pretty much every driver on track taking advantage of this pause to proceedings, with Tagliani managing to still come out in front of Dixon, whilst Weldon would end up dropping to 6th behind Servia and Franchitti, with Dario managing to get the jump on the pair of them. But in the midst of all this, trouble would occur for one of the big players, as Will Power, who was in 7th before the caution came out, would end up leaving the pit lane with 3 wheels on his wagon. Now, I'm no expert, but I'm pretty sure you need 4 wheels to be able to run the thing properly. Willpower and pit stop blunders, what a perfect combination. Makes you wonder if that will happen when he's at Andretti next year. Power would make it back to the pit, this time getting 4 wheels instead of 3, but would end up dropping to the back of the pack, effectively wrecking any chance he had of winning his first ever 500. The pace car would come in at the end of lap 26, and just like on the first lap, Dixon would once again get the jump on Tagliani, with Alex clearly not learning from the first time. And if Alex thought he could re-overtake Scott straight away, he wouldn't be allowed to do so, as straight after Dixon got the lead, the pace car was brought out again when the second KV racing car of EJ Vizo would end up crashing out at turn 1 as a result of being turned around by the Newman Haas of James Hinchcliffe, who got pinched by the Sam Schmidt Motorsports car of Jay Howard. The action got back underway at the start of lap 34, and after Dixon got the jump on him on the previous 2 starts, Tagliani would get his own back and retake the lead off Dixon into turn 1, whilst Franchitti and Weldon would also gain a place at the restart at the expense of Bell and Servia respectively. Weldon would continue this momentum later on in the lap by overtaking T-Bell on the back straight to move back up into 4th place, whilst Dixon meanwhile would quickly regain the lead from Tagliani on the following lap, once again into turn 1. Servia's miserable race on the other hand would end up continuing, as Ed Carpenter, Vitor Meira and Tony Kanaan would all pass the Spaniard, dropping him down to 9th. Moving on to lap 44, and after being stuck behind for a few laps, Franchitti would finally get by on Tagliani into turn 3 to move up into 2nd place, making it a Chip Ganassi 1-2 in the process, whilst former Chip Ganassi driver Dan Weldon would also get by on Tagliani shortly afterwards to get himself up into the top 3. Behind them, and on lap 48, Tony Kanaan, after passing the slow Oriol Servia, would start to charge his way through the order, getting by on both Vitor Meira and Ed Carpenter to move up to 6th position, so far making a great recovery after only qualifying down in 22nd position. Moving ahead to the end of lap 60, and it was time for the second round of pit stops, with the leaders all making their stops, with Alex Tagliani being able to retake 3rd from Weldon. Tony Kanaan would also pit around this time, but unfortunately for TK, his pit stop would end up being a disaster, as thanks to the mechanics on Pippa Mann's car releasing her into the path of TK, Tony would end up missing his pit box, and would have to be wheeled back by his mechanics, dropping him down the order in the process. While all that was happening though, the pace car would be brought out for the 3rd time as a result of Jay Howard having a similar issue to what Will Power had, in that his rear wheel wasn't attached properly, sending his car into the barriers and bringing his race to a close. Thanks to the pace car coming out, it allowed Dario, who pitted the lap after Dixon, to get the jump on his teammate, to move into the lead of the race once it went back to green. The start of lap 71 would be when the action would get back underway, with Franchitti being able to fend off from Dixon to hold on to the lead. 2 laps later though, and team tactics would start to intervene, with Franchitti letting Dixon through on the pit straight to retake the lead, in the hopes of trying to pull a gap to Tagliani, who was right behind. This would end up working to some degree, with Tagliani being unable to overhaul the 2 Chip Ganassis in front, to the point where a bit later on, specifically before lap 86, Dan Weldon would finally get back ahead of the Canadian to move back up into the podium places. Dan would then come in at the end of lap 97, as would his unofficial teammate Townsend Bell, as the 3rd round of pit stops got underway. Tagliani would then pit a lap later, with him removing a bit of bodywork on the rear to help cool the car, before race leader Dixon would pit a further lap later, with Franchitti pitting the lap afterwards. And just like the previous time Dario came in, the caution would be brought out for the 4th time, as a result of James Hinchcliffe getting too high at turn 3 and crashing into the barrier, just as the race had reached the halfway point. Because of the timing of this caution, it did mix the field up a bit, with Oriol Servia, Marco Andretti and Ed Carpenter gaining places thanks to them being in the pits when the caution was called, whilst Dario Franchitti, who was in the box at the same time as them, being able to retake the lead again. The race would get going again at the start of lap 108, with the top 4 maintaining position, whilst battles would continue on from behind. Dixon and Weldon would thankfully only drop to 5th and 6th respectively during the whole mix-up, whilst for Alex Tagliani, he would end up dropping outside the top 10 after the restart, specifically in around 12th place, as the bodywork that was removed from his car would end up having an impact on his top-end speed. 3 laps after the restart, and Helio Castroneves, who was a lap down in the Penske, would get his lap back by unlapping Dario Franchitti into the first corner, which in turn allowed Oriol Servia to get onto the back of the Scotsman. Dario would use the tow from Helio to keep in front of the Spaniard, but then on lap 113, Oriol would get a good run on Dario at the exit of turn 2 to get past the Chip Ganassi driver heading into turn 3 to take the lead of the race. Oriol, just like with Dario earlier, would use the draft from Helio to stay in front of the target car, with him and Dario starting to break away from the rest of the field, whilst Townsend Bell in the meantime would overtake Weldon again unseen by the cameras to move up into 6th position. Servia would then eventually lap Helio on lap 120, putting a car between himself and Franchitti. Dixon, meanwhile, after being down in 5th for a while, would manage to get by on both Andretti and Carpenter to move himself up into the final podium place, with Carpenter slipping back down to 7th behind Bell and Weldon, with Weldon on lap 125 re-overtaking Bell to move himself up into 5th. 4 laps later, and after finally relapping Helio in front, Dario would get onto the back of Oriol Servia down the pit straight to once again retake the lead of the race. Tagliani's race, meanwhile, would end up going from bad to worse, with him falling down the order into 18th, which would eventually lead to the pole sitter being lapped by Franchitti on lap 135 to compile his miserable race even further. That lap would also see the 4th round of stops get underway, with Townsend Bell peeling off first before Weldon would follow suit a lap later. Lap 137 would see Servia be the first of the top 3 to pit before the 2 Chip Ganassis would follow suit a lap later, with Dario managing to stay in front of the Spaniard once he completed his stop. Dario, thanks to adjustments he made to his car during his stop, would pull away from Servia, leaving the Spaniard to fend off from Dixon, a battle which would end up being futile as Dixon would find a way through on Servia to once again make it a Chip Ganassi 1-2, whilst Weldon meanwhile would find a way through on Andretti to move up to 4th. Then, on lap 148, the 5th caution of the day would be brought out, as Alex Tagliani's miserable day would finally come to an end, when he would smack the wall on the outside of turn 4 thanks to getting up on the dirt, whilst JR Hildebrand, who was on a charge, was trying to lap in. And my word, would that end up being a foreshadow for later on. With the caution being out, many saw this as an opportunity to get a free pit stop, which included the likes of Marco Andretti and Townsend Bell, who were towards the front of the field before the pace car came out. The pace car would come in at the end of lap 155, but as Dario accelerated, his teammate Dixon would end up getting boxed by lap traffic in front, which allowed Servia to retake 2nd and nearly allow Weldon to also get through as well. Dixon would end up fending the position, which in turn compromised Dan to the point where he lost places to both Graham Rahal, who had taken advantage of most of the field pitting, and Tony Kanaan, who had recovered from his pit disaster. Rahal, meanwhile, didn't stop there, as using the momentum he had, he would get past Scott Dixon into the first corner to move up into 3rd position. Kanaan would also close up to the back of Dixon, but before he had a chance to try and pass him, the caution would once again come out on lap 158 due to Ryan Briscoe and Townsend Bell, the latter of which pitted during the previous caution, colliding with each other at the first corner, preventing Bell from having any chance of trying to make his strategy work. Throughout the race, Penske's day had been a nightmare, and to compile their misery even worse, Castroneves, at roughly the same time Briscoe crashed out, would sustain a rear right puncher, forcing him to make an impromptu stop. During this caution period, some very interesting strategies would play out, with Dario Franchitti and JR Hildebrand opting to pit to fill their tanks up to the brim in the hopes that with some fuel saving they could get to the end of the race. This would hand Oil Servia the lead when it went back to green at the start of lap 166, but his lead wouldn't last too long as Rahal would manage to get the jump on Servia at the restart to take to the front of the field, whilst behind, Thomas Scheckter, who had had a quiet race up until this point, would get by on both Dan Wheldon and Tony Kanaan to move up into 4th. Wheldon, meanwhile, taking advantage of Scheckter getting by, would initially re-overtake Kanaan into P5 before TK would get him back not too long later. TK and Wheldon would then re-overtake Scheckter, sending the son of Jody back down to 6th, and from that point, TK would start to close in on the top 3. Speaking of the top 3, and at the start of lap 170, Dixon, after being mugged on the previous restart, would finally get back ahead of Servia to move up into 2nd, setting his sights on Rahal, while Servia would lose a further place, this time to the charging Kanaan. 2 laps later, and Dixon would finally get back ahead of Rahal to retake the lead of the race, but with his teammate on a different strategy, it was going to be interesting to see which one of them was on the correct strategy. Dixon would then start to pull a bit of a gap once Rahal and Kanaan started switching places with each other, while Servia and Wheldon got to witness this from behind. Lap 178 is when the final round of stops got underway, with Dan Wheldon being first to pit, with Dixon, Rahal, Kanaan and Servia pitting straight afterwards. Kanaan and Wheldon would be able to get the jump on Rahal and Servia, but Dixon would still come out in front of that group. But importantly, they would come out behind Franchitti and Hildebrand, who were trying to get to the end of the race, whilst the 4 drivers that were in front of them, which were Danica Patrick, Thomas Scheckter, Bertrand Baguette, yes that is his actual last name, and Marco Andretti, who pitted at the same time Townsend Bell did, would need to pit before the end of the race, particularly Danica, who as a result of pitting on lap 159 would need to come in towards the end for a splash and dash in order to get to the finish. This effectively wiped out any chance of those 4 potentially trying to get the win, so the focus was really on Franchitti and Hildebrand, and whether they would make it to the end of the race on the fuel they had. Lap 185, and Baguette would grab P2 off Scheckter, with the Belgians' eye set on trying to catch Patrick before they would have to make their final stops. 4 laps later is when Thomas Scheckter would make his final stop, and whilst he was going down the pit lane, Baguette would take advantage of the lack of straight line speed Patrick had to become the 9th different leader of the race, leading Patrick to bail into the pits a lap later, along with Andretti, which would lift Franchitti and Hildebrand into 2nd and 3rd respectively. With 7 laps to go, Franchitti would start to conserve fuel a bit more, as he still wasn't in the range to make it to the end of the race. This in turn would allow Hildebrand, who had conserved more fuel, to close up onto the back of him, and then with 4 laps to go, Hildebrand would get around Franchitti on the pit straight to move up into 2nd place, which would then become the lead when Baguette would pit at the end of the same lap. Franchitti at this point would essentially coast to try and get to the end, which in doing so would allow Dixon and Wheldon, who were free to push, to get by on the Scotsman to move up to 2nd and 3rd respectively. Then, with 2 laps to go, Wheldon, who had passed Kanaan unseen by the cameras and had been closing in on Dixon prior to passing Franchitti, would eventually get past the Kiwi on the back straight to move up into 2nd. Wheldon would begin to eat chunks into the man who took his seat at Panther, but even with the fuel conserving that Hildebrand was doing, it wouldn't be enough for Dan to overhaul him. Heading into the final lap, and the stage was set for JR Hildebrand to become the first rookie since Helio Castroneves in 2001 to win the biggest spectacle in racing in his rookie year, with him only needing to bring his car home to win on the circuit's 100th anniversary. But heading into the final 2 corners, Hildebrand would come up to traffic, in the form of Charlie Kimball, who had run out of fuel with just a couple of corners to go. JR, approaching the slow-moving Chip Ganassi, would try to go around him at the final corner, with Kimball trying to stick to his line to stay out of the way. But in doing so, Hildebrand would get caught on the same dirty part of the track Tagliani caught when he was alongside him earlier on and smacked the car into the outside wall, damaging his front right suspension in the process. Even though he had damaged his car, the front straight was the only bit of track left that Hildebrand needed to clear in order to take the win. But in the process of him trying to accelerate, Dan Wheldon, who had been eating into his lead, would blast past him just after the pit entrance to steal the lead from under his nose, and with it, become a two-time Indy 500 winner. In one of the most dramatic finishes in the race's long illustrious history, Dan Wheldon, who had not led a lap up until that point, would take advantage of Hildebrand's drama on the last lap to win in a chassis that was 8 years old, and with it, gave Brian Herter Autosport their first ever IndyCar win. Dan could hardly believe what he had achieved, and even though it was lucky, he was there to capitalise when it mattered the most, and his pace throughout that race put him back on the radar for teams wanting to hire his services for 2012, with the Brickyard once again saving someone's career. For Hildebrand though, it was a heartbreaking moment, and given how the rest of his career panned out in IndyCar, it is sadly the one thing that he is mostly remembered for, with him being one corner away from creating history. Now, it's easy to criticise Hildebrand in this moment for being impatient with a back marker, but having looked at the footage, I don't think there was anything Hildebrand could have done to avoid it, as given how rapidly Wheldon was closing in on him on the last lap, had Hildebrand waited patiently behind Kimball, who had ran out of fuel, there's a very good chance Dan would have still got him at the line once JR had finally been able to get around him. The only person you can criticise for this was Charlie Kimball, as whilst him running out of fuel was unfortunate, he could have done a much better job in getting out of the way of Hildebrand, given how dirty the outside line was around the final corner, as rather than parking it on the inside, he could have bailed to where the alternate pit entrance was in order to stay well clear of the leaders. Having said that, it does make me wonder whether Charlie was informed about Hildebrand being behind him, and if he wasn't, then some blame can be taken away from him. Because of this moment though, we would end up having two different types of emotion. One consisting of heartbreak in the case of Hildebrand, with him being one straight away from grabbing his first ever win, whilst the other in the case of Wheldon being the utter jubilation in him winning the 500 in what was originally penned to be a one-off return for him, with the aim of making his full-time return in 2012. Sadly, as we know, he wouldn't get the chance to do that, as little did we know at the time, his win at the Indy 500 would end up being his final win, as later on in the year, in a deal which saw Dan race for Sam Schmidt-Peterson for the final two races, Dan would be tragically killed in a multi-car accident at the finale in Las Vegas, a race in which to this day, people still question whether it should have gone ahead, given concerns that were raised about the circuit's safety, especially with how many cars were entered into the race. His death would sadly prevent the world from seeing Dan make a full-time return, especially given that he was set to reunite with Andretti from the start of 2012, replacing the NASCAR-bound Danica Patrick. The 2011 edition of the race as a result is remembered for two reasons, one for the last lap crash involving JR Hildebrand and the other being the final time that Wheldon took to the top step of the podium, and a final reminder of how much of a special talent he really was. The 2011 Indianapolis 500, one of the most dramatic races in the Brickyard's history, and one in which to this day leaves people emotional.